The economy is a very confusing thing, and apparently it had a bunch of hiccups in 2006 with the Great Recession, which sounds kind of like the world's economy wanting to break up with us. But it didn't quite want to move out of our apartment just yet, so it had to reseed itself. Bad jokes aside, here's what external debt actually means. External debt is the sum of a country's public debt, meaning the debt that it owes to another country that can be paid for with international currency, goods, or services. And private debt, which is the debt that most people have as individuals, means that the debt is owed to a bank. Coming up, we look at some countries with the biggest external debt, including Sweden, Brazil, and of course, we'll have a look at the American debt, how it got to be where it was, and why. And perhaps along the way, we'll even devise some theories on how it can all be cured. But first, Brazil. Brazil's economy may be the largest in Latin America. The country makes its money through agriculture and tourism, but it's also the home to Embraer, which is the third largest producer of civilian aircraft, right behind Airbus and Boeing. Brazil has been the biggest supplier of coffee in the world for 150 years or so, which is great because it's coffee. Coffee is love. Coffee is life. Coffee is delicious, and we have mostly Brazil to thank for our supply of it. But back in the 90s, the real Brazilian currency was close to equal to the United States dollar. Nowadays, though, thanks to a global recession, it's closer to 3.45 Brazilian dollars to a dollar. The external debt of Brazil is quite significant, at 726 billion and growing as of the writing of this video. But that number is going up constantly. And when I say constantly, I mean at the rate of about $2,000 every 5 seconds or so. Which means in the time it took me to say that last sentence, it went up probably about $6,000 to $8,000. Sweden. Sweden's economy is doing pretty well these days. In fact, the country currently sits as the 7th richest country in the world as far as their gross domestic product goes. In fact, the citizens of Sweden live very rich lives on average. Think upper middle class. Their economy is based heavily on foreign trade. And while the Swedes do export more peaceful things like timber, hydropower, and iron ore, not to mention cars and medicine, Sweden is also in fact the 9th largest arms exporter in the world. Interestingly enough though, despite being part of the EU, Sweden kept its currency, the krona. With all the trading and gunsmithing, Sweden's debt to gross domestic product per capita is 43.40%, while its total external debt lingers somewhere around $216 billion. Australia. Did you know that there was actually more to Australia than just kangaroos, boomerangs, shrimp on the Barbie, and deadly animals that kill you hiding in every single corner? Well, as it turns out, it's also home to a very strong economy and a pretty low poverty rate, which is really odd, considering how expensive it is to live in any of the major cities. Anyways, it's the economy that's the 12th largest growing in the world. In fact, Australia was the only country with an advanced economy to not go through a recession back in 2008. So good on you, Aussies. But right now, the country's external debt sits at about $387 billion and growing, with the debt to GDP percent at 36.8. Now, the economy is not Australians' biggest issue. They have bigger things to worry about, like deadly heat, deadly animals, and deadly death. We're just kidding, Australia. However, your animals are terrifying. Italy. Also known as the Boot, the third most populous EU state, Italy, is the birthplace of the Renaissance and home to the ruins of the once great Roman civilization. Italy is also the world's biggest wine producer and is known for its vast vineyards. Of course, it's also home to the Ferrari, so it's no surprise then that Italy is ranked 6th for most manufacturing worldwide. But remember how Australia didn't really get hit hard at all in the 2008 crisis? Well, as it turns out, Italy sure did. In fact, it got hit really hard, So hard that its public debt was over 135% of their gross domestic product 2 years ago. Well, that was 2 years ago, so surely they must have picked themselves back up again, right? What is it now? Oh, it's 132% of their gross domestic product, which is not really an improvement at all. Italy's total external debt sits at $2 trillion and growing. Luxembourg. This country is tiny. Landlocked between Belgium, Germany, and France, the whole thing is about the size of Rhode Island in the United States. Luxembourg sports a military force of just 800 soldiers and 17 aircraft. It had to ask for Belgium's help just to buy a single A500M cargo plane. Luxembourg, despite its small size, has its own language, Luxembourgeois. Their slogan, "We want to remain what we are," pretty much sums the little country up. And they're happy where they are, and they would love to stay independent. Which is kind of odd considering that they've amassed over $12 billion in external debt, at 3,443% debt per capita. Now, that's seriously a really terrible number. But the little country is somehow not bankrupt, so they must be doing something right. France. France is a country with a rich heritage and a great culture, which is defined by its romantic tendencies. If you ever decide to take a vacation to France, you should check out the Louvre in Paris, home of the original Mona Lisa, as well as many, many other famous paintings. France can arguably boast more than just its culture, though, as it's the world's 9th largest economy. It's also a member of the Eurozone and uses the euro as its main currency. AXA, the world's biggest insurance company, has its headquarters in France. But financially, however, France isn't really doing so great. With over $5 trillion of external debt, which is just about 222% of their gross domestic product. Japan. Nippon, the small island country which is next to Asia, keeps a pretty strict policy of isolation from the rest of the world. That was until 1853, when the United States sent its navy to physically convince the Japanese to open up their borders, which they did. Soon after, Japan's whole country got turned upside down, with the samurai getting tossed aside for modernization. This led to a civil war, but modernization won out. And today, Japan's economy is the 3rd largest in the world by nominal GDP. It's also the world's 4th largest exporter and importer. And Japan's on this list because of its over $9 trillion in debt. Now, that's a pretty big number for a little country. But if you look at Japan's debt to gross domestic product, it sits at about 220%. And that's not good. The United Kingdom. Hey, guess what? The Brexit didn't actually kill the UK. In fact, they seem to be doing just fine, which is really good for them. Everyone was expecting Britain to fall apart after leaving the EU, but those stubborn British buggers proved they were more than a match for what was to come. Or did they? While it's true that the country is still very much alive and kicking, they show no signs of fully collapsing anytime soon. However, their debt to GDP sits at 408%, with over $2 trillion in overall external debt. And now for some honorable mentions. Speaking of the EU, the European Union sits at over $13 trillion. Germany is at close to $6 trillion. Switzerland is $1 trillion. Ireland, the land of the green, is almost $2 trillion. And the Netherlands sits at over $3 trillion. And that all leaves us finally to come to the United States. The good old US of A. A federal republic, not a democracy by the way, that spans a large portion of the globe, well past the North American continent. We own islands in the Pacific and the Caribbean. We're also the 3rd most populous nation in the world with over 324 million people. The United States is also one of the youngest countries, and we were only founded about 240 years ago. But speaking of our independence, Did you know that half of the country wanted to stay a British colony? Oh, and that France pretty much won the war for us with their powerful naval fleet? Just a little history lesson. The United States has the best military in the world, objectively, and our economy is super strong compared to most of the rest of the world. The culture is widespreading and quite influential. Oh, but we're literally the most in-debt country on the planet, at $20 trillion and counting. But in good news, it's only 114% of our gross domestic product. So we can change some things and get that number lower. This has been a look at countries with the most external debt in the world. But what do you think? Let us know in the comments below. And thanks for watching.